I'd like you to turn your Bibles to one verse that we're going to read, and then I'll jump into another passage from which we're going to talk today's thought. One verse from Psalm 81, verses 5. Psalm 81, verses 5. The point is, this verse, in any translation, any other translation, apart from the one that I'm going to read, if you don't have the translation, you would be looking for the verse. You'd be thinking, where is that? Where is that? But I'm going to read from a translation called Message Version. In any other translation, it's just one single line, the last part of verses 5. Okay? The last part of verses 5. Chapter 81, so Psalm 81, verses 5. But this is the Message Version that I'm reading right now. The second part of verses 5. I hear the most gentle whisper from the one I never guessed would speak to me. I hear a gentle whisper from the one who I never guessed would speak to me. In any other translation, it would just be simply one underline, one single statement that would say, I've heard an unknown voice, or I've heard an unknown language, something like that. But this is the only version. I loved it, the way he translated it. I heard the most gentle whisper from the one I never guessed would speak to me. Well, that's the basis of our series. We're going to talk about it today. We're starting a series called Whisper. And I'll talk to you about why we are calling it a whisper. Our God is a communicating God. Right from the beginning of the creation, right from the beginning of the creation of man and the finished work of Christ, and until now, God never ceased to speak from speaking to man. He never stopped speaking to man. He continues to speak to human beings, week after week, day after day. If you are in communion with Him every single day, if you're walking with Him every day, every moment of your life, He would continue to speak to us. The scriptures, in fact, begin with the words, in the beginning, God said. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 starts off with that. In the beginning, God spoke. It's interesting that that's how the Bible ends. If you come to Revelation chapter 22, the penultimate verse of Revelation, of course, the last verse is about the blessing, but the penultimate verse closes off like this. The one who testifies to these things says, I'm coming soon. So he begins the scripture that we have in our hand begins with God speaking, ends with God speaking. He's just a communicating God. He loves to talk to people. Throughout human existence, God spoke to people in various ways, at various times. Hebrews chapter 1 verses 1 says that. God spoke to us at many times, in many ways, through many people. He never stopped speaking. In the beginning, God said, let there be light. Those 4 words are still creating the galaxies at the outer edges of this universe. If you know that, if you know the astrophysics, you know that the universe continues to grow. Even now, imagine right in the beginning when God said, let there be light, and as the creation began to unfold, from that moment, even today, the creation is still expanding. The word of God has that kind of power. It just continues to create that word long back when He said, let there be light. How did God do it? He did it with His voice when He created the universe. It's almost as if the universe is the way of God is saying, look at what I can do with 4 words. That's the power of the voice of God. And if God can create the entire universe with 4 words, what are we worried about in our lives? The voice that spoke the universe into existence is the same voice that parted the Red Sea and made the sun stand still. It's the same voice that can heal a withered hand and wither a barren fig tree. His voice can turn water into wine and install synaptic connections between optic nerves and the visual cortex. of a blind man and resurrect a man who is dead for 4 days by simply saying, Lazarus, come out. His voice is powerful. There is nothing that God's voice cannot say or cannot do. And frankly, he can do whatever he wants, however he wants. He can speak through a burning bush, or he can speak through a Balaam's donkey. He can speak however he wants, whenever he wants, however he chooses to speak to us. His voice can stop a storm on a sea, the Sea of Galilee, with 3 simple words: peace, be still. Whenever we talk about voice, we think of phonics. But actually, sound waves are physics, right? We know that. Most people know, I know, and I'm sure, you will be part of that, what I'm about to say, that would say, you have never heard the voice of God. And I understand that. You've never heard the voice of God. And if you're talking about the audible voice of God that falls between 20 to 20,000 hertz, even me, I didn't hear the voice of God. But the point is this, that the voice of God is not limited to our range of hearing. In other words, God's ability to speak is not limited to our ability to hear. He uses his voice to create the universe. He uses his voice to comfort while he's convicting. He uses his voice to heal as he reveals himself. He uses his voice to guide us with grace. Here's what I know for sure, that God is speaking. Even today, even now, that God is speaking. The question is, are you listening? Are you listening? Well, let me rephrase it. The question should be, is God's voice the loudest that you hear today? Or maybe I should ask you this way, when was the last time you heard the voice of God? Out of that, that question gave birth to this series, and I think this is the most important thing that we can teach you as pastors of this church. If there is nothing else that we can teach you apart from this, I'll be happy, man. If after this series, if God calls me home, I'll go as a happy man. Because there is nothing else better that I can teach you as a church than to teach you how to listen to God, to the voice of God. You see, hearing the voice of God is really important. Learning to hear the voice of God is really important because it's a solution to 1,000 problems. I'll talk about it today. It's a solution to 1,000 problems. It's the key to discover your destiny. What's more, it's the key to fulfill your potential. If you want to achieve your full potential in your life, you've got to learn to hear the voice of God. If you want to know the destiny of your life, you've got to learn to listen to the voice of God. If you want a solution for a problem, you've got to learn to listen to the voice of God. Right from the beginning, he spoke to people in dreams, he spoke through their desires, he spoke through pain in various circumstances. He uses different kind of people to speak to people. He used visions to speak to people. He spoke in thunders, he spoke audibly, and he spoke mostly in whispers. Whenever he spoke to man, he spoke in whispers. Remember the famous passage where Elijah was really tired of his work, his life, and he's almost at a verge of committing suicide because apparently he lost the will to live. And so he goes to God and he's saying, God, I'm really tired. There's nobody along with me. I feel I'm the loneliest guy. Please take me, God. I guess I'm ready to die right now. And God nurtures him back to health and then begins to speak to him. I love that passage. I want you to turn your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 11 and 12. That's not my main passage, but that's my introduction for today. The Lord said, he's talking to Elijah. The Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord. For the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. After the fire came a gentle whisper. ESV, the version that we give you as a gift, calls it a low whisper. NASB, American Standard Version, says a gentle blowing. If you have a KJV, it would simply say a still small voice. A still small voice. By definition, a whisper is speaking with one's breath rather than one's vocal cords. Well, I'm speaking right now with my vocal cords. Whisper is speaking with your breath. So the theological significance of this verse is this, that it's a pretty profound when you begin to understand God speaking in whispers, that God breathed into dust and formed Adam. In other words, Adam once was a whisper. We're all whispers. Everything else is a whisper. 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 16 says, all scriptures are God-breathed. God-breathed. So even Bible is God whispering to us. See, right from the creation all the way to now, God continues to whisper to us. Hold that thought in your mind. And then jump to another passage. I'm taking you to 2-3 different passages before I actually hit my exposition today. Psalm 23. In Psalm 23, sorry, not Psalm 23, 29. Psalm 29, David writes about the voice of God. And it's brilliant, the way he talks about the voice of God. Again, I'm reading from Message version. The whole chapter is about the voice of God. But let me read it in Message version. This is what it goes. Verses 3. God thunders across the waters. Brilliant. His voice and his face. Streaming brightness. God across the flood waters. God's thunder tympanic. His thunder symphonic. God's thunder smashes cedars. God topples the northern cedars. The mountain ranges skip like spring colts. The high ridges jump like wild kid goats. God's thunder spits fire. God's thunders, the wilderness quakes. He makes the desert of Kadesh shake. God's thunder sets the oak trees dancing, a wild dance at that whirling. The pelting rain strips their branches. We all fall to our knees and call out, glory. You see the description of God's voice? What he's saying is, if you really hear the voice of God, your head will break. That's what he's saying. You can't even stand in the presence of God if you begin to hear the voice of God. If God, with his full voice, full energy, begins to speak to us, we will die instantly. At low levels, sound is imperceptible. At high levels, it's unignorable, right? If sound exceeds 110 decibels, we experience a change in our blood pressure. If it exceeds 141 decibels, we become nauseous. If it exceeds 145 decibels, our vision blurs because our eyeballs are shaking, vibrating. At 195 decibels, our eardrums are in danger of rupturing. And death by sound can actually happen at 202 decibels. Maybe you can actually die at 202 decibels. The opposite of that end of sound spectrum is just above the absolute threshold of hearing. It's a whisper. On the other side, if God speaks with his voice, you will die. With this voice, he is actually giving you an opportunity to live. This whisper probably measures around 15 decibels. Let me double back to 1 Kings chapter 19, where Elijah was. We tend to dismiss the natural phenomena that took place, the earthquake, the fire, the thunder and all that. We tend to, dismiss the natural phenomena which precedes a whisper as insignificant because the Lord's voice was not in them, right? But could it be possible that God allowed the thunder, the earthquake, the fire to catch the attention of Elijah? And as he began to pay attention, God quietly began to speak to him. Sometimes what happens in our lives could be an announcement from God by saying, pay attention to me, pay attention to me. You see, God has an outside voice, the voice that the psalmist describes, and he's not afraid to use it. But when God wants to be heard, when he has to say something too important for you, too important for us to miss, not to miss in other words, he often speaks to us in whispers, just above the threshold of hearing. The question is, why? Why would he speak in whispers? How would he speak in whispers? When and where does he speak? I can answer all those questions, but the problem is I can't answer them in one message. That's why the series, basically. But today, let me just, we're going to come back to the why question one more time 2 weeks from now. But let me just, as a heads up, give you a little bit of thought for you to munch on over the next 2 weeks. Why would God speak to us in whispers? Just a thought. Think through this. By the time we come on the third week, we will look at it a little more deeper. When someone speaks whisper, think about this. When someone speaks in a whisper, you have to get very close to them. Isn't it? You have to get very close to hear to them. Sometimes you have to put your ear right beside their mouth so that you could hear them next to their mouth. We lean in to whisper. It's almost as if God is saying, that's what I want. That you would get closer to me, that you would lean into me and pay attention to me. We think the goal of hearing God's voice is hearing his voice. That's what we think. But I think the goal, that's not God's goal, by the way, remember that. God's goal, I think, when he's speaking to us in speaking whispers, the goal of God speaking to us in whispers is that we may get closer to him. We may begin to pay attention to him. It's almost like a father, as our children growing up, we know that some of us as fathers, we'd love to hug them, and we every time we come back home after a long day's work, we'd like to have a hug from them. But if they're busy with something else, we'll call them on the pretext of saying something to them. Hey, I want to tell you something, come here. And as the child comes closer to, you'll say, no, come closer. I have something for you, a very important thing for you. And then as they come closer and closer, and they're near, almost as if both of your cheeks are touching each other, the one thing that we do is just hug them like a bear hug. There's nothing to say to them, it's just that we wanted a hug. If you have a chocolate in your pocket, you probably would give a chocolate after that. But if there is nothing, you would say, thank you. It's almost as if God really wants you to come that closer before he begins to speak to you. It's almost as if he wants to have that intimacy with you that he speaks in whispers. Aren't you grateful that we have a gentle God? That the Almighty, who could intimidate us with his outside voice, chooses to woo us towards himself with his intimate voice. with a whisper. Well, let me just extend that thought a little more for you to a little more munch on a little more. This whisper that God speaks with, his whisper is the very breath of life. We started off with that. I knew, according to the Jewish traditions, the name of God, Yahweh, was too sacred to pronounce. I don't know if you remember 2 weeks ago, I talked about how, the Jews the scribes who would copy manuscripts would go through this ritual of cleaning themselves before they even pen down the word Yahweh on the manuscripts, on their copying papers. It was too sacred for them to pronounce the name Yahweh. But there is another tradition that I recently came to know in Judaism, with the word Yahweh, that this tradition believes that the name of God, Yahweh, without vowels, would go like this: Yod, He, Vav, He. Yod, He, Vav, He. The YWH. Yod, He, Vav, He. It's actually synonymous with the sound of breathing. This is a Jewish tradition, that's what they believe, that these 4 letters, Hebrew letters, actually sound like the sound of, what is that? Breathing. Now think with me, this is an amazing thought. That the name that is too sacred to pronounce, Yahweh, on one hand, is also, on the other hand, is whispered with each and every breath that we take on the earth. That in a day, nearly 23,000 times, every single day, we breathe in and breathe out his name. That means you can't even live without actually saying the name of God. He is the breath of life for us, In him we live, we move, and have our being. No wonder the psalmist says that it's in him we live, we move, and have our being. So it's really, really, really important for us to understand the importance of hearing the voice of God, to understand how to understand and learn how to hear the voice of God. This whole series is on that. Today, I just wanted to talk about the importance of hearing the voice of God. For the next 10-15 minutes, I'm going to make 4 statements that will help me to put into perspective of the importance, with this thought of why is it important for us to hear the voice of God. Next week, we will look at what stops us from hearing the voice of God. What is that stops us from hearing the voice of God? And then the following week, we will talk about how do we position ourselves to hear the voice of God. Because there are certain things that we must learn to do before we begin to hear the voice of God. And then the week after that, we will look at how does God speak to us? What are the ways in which God does speak to us? And then towards the end of the series, we will look at how do we know whether God is speaking or Satan is speaking to us. Is that okay? Does it make sense to you? So therefore, don't miss the next 6 weeks. You will miss a lot. This is the most important lessons, teaching that you can ever learn for your life. If you miss any other Sunday after that, I have no problem. Miss all the Sundays after that. I don't have any problem. If you can learn on how to hear the voice of God, you are set for life. I'm telling you, my job is done as your pastor. If you can simply learn to hear the voice of God and follow it. Let me make 4 important observations on why is it important for us to hear the voice of God from a very familiar passage that we love. If you're a Christian from your childhood, you probably heard this story like thousands of times. 1 Samuel chapter 3. The story of little Samuel hearing the voice of God. In chapter 2, In 1 Samuel chapter 2, you will look at how Hannah was praying to God, asking for a child and committing that if God grants her a child, she would dedicate the child back to God. And when God does grant her a child, as the child leaves weaning, probably 2 years old or hardly 2 years old, she then fulfills her commitment to God by bringing Samuel and offering Samuel as a servant to Eli at the temple, and Samuel begins to grow there at the temple in Jerusalem. That's how you'll see chapter 3, beginning of chapter 3. Let me read it for you. Chapter 3, verses 1 to 11. I know you know this story, but it's just a good thing for us to read one more time. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel served the Lord, assisting Eli. Now, in those days, the messages from the Lord are very rare, and visions were quite uncommon. One night, Eli, who was almost blind by now, had gone to bed. The lamp of Lord has not yet gone out, and Samuel was sleeping in the tabernacle near the ark of God. Suddenly the Lord called out, "Samuel." "Yes," Samuel replied. "What is it?" He got up and ran to Eli. "Here I am. Did you call me?" "I didn't call you," Eli replied. "Go back to bed." So Samuel did. Then the Lord called out again, "Samuel." Again Samuel got up and went to Eli. "Here I am. Did you call me?" "I didn't call you, my son," Eli said. "Go back to bed." Samuel did not yet know the Lord because he had never heard a message from the Lord before. So the Lord called a third time. And once more, Samuel got up and went to Eli. "Here I am. Did you call me?" Then Eli realized it was the Lord who was calling the boy. So he said to Samuel, "Go and lie down again. And if someone calls again, say, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went back to the bed. And the Lord came and called as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel replied, "Speak, your servant is listening." Let me pause there. I'll come back to verses 11 and the few verses later there. Speak, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Probably the 7 most important words we should ever say in our lives. I'll come to that. I'll close with that thought actually. But I want to make 4 observations out of this passage that teach us why is it important for us to listen to the voice of God. Is that okay? Can I make that? This is very important for you to learn. You already know you need to hear the voice of God, but let me just challenge you not, to understand the importance of listening to the voice of God. Number 1, what we perceive and experience to be relational, spiritual, emotional, and even physical problems could actually be hearing problems. What we perceive to be relational, spiritual, emotional, or physical problems in your life right now could actually be hearing problems because we probably are deafened to the voice of God. You may not know this, that most of us have problems in our lives because we stopped hearing the voice of God. Our ears have become deafened to the voice of God. About half a century ago, or a little more than that, Dr. Alfred Tomatis, I like the name, tomato. Tomatis was confronted with the most curious case in his 50 years career as otolaryngologist. Otolaryngology is a branch of medicine that has to deal with ear, nose, and throat, the problems of ear, nose, and throat, and things like that. You see, in front of him sat a renowned singer. I'm a speaker, so obviously I'll talk about speakers. An opera singer who was sitting right in front of him, who mysteriously lost his ability to hit certain notes that he was previously able to do. In fact, those notes, if you're a singer, you understand what I'm talking about. Even if you're not a singer, it doesn't matter. Just understand that our voices has different notes that we can hit. Even though he was hitting them before, now he stopped hitting those notes for some mysterious reason. In fact, those notes are well within his vocal range. He just lost the ability to hit those notes. He was doing good, but he just lost the ability to hit those notes. And you know how important for an opera singer to hit those high notes, right? So he went to every doctor that is possible, and most doctors who were specialized in this thought it was an vocal problem. And then finally he ended up with Dr. Tomatis. But Dr. Tomatis thought otherwise. This is what he did. Using a sonometer. Sonometer is the one that measures the sound, right? Sonometer, Dr. Tomatis determined that this opera singer was producing a nearly 140 decibel sound waves at meters distance. That's a lot of sound, by the way. It's the sound of a jet engine taking off from a carrier, aircraft carrier. That's the sound. His voice was that high at meters length, 140 decibels. This discovery led to a diagnosis, that the opera singer was deafened by his own voice. It's called the Tomatis effect, by the way, in medicine. He was hitting his voice so high that his voice itself drowned his ears, the ability to hear. That the voice that is coming forth out of him made him not to hear his high notes, and because he's not able to hear the high notes, he stopped singing the high notes. Now you get the point? I think we all have a spiritual Tomatis effect. That there are so many noises around us that come from us, that come from around us, to which we are paying so much of attention, devoting so much of our time, that we stopped listening to the whispers of God. I'll give you 4 voices that we usually allow to deafen our ears. Number 1, it's a negative self-talk. We have a problem, we always talk negative about ourselves. Yes, of course we are sinners. Yes, of course we are imperfect people. Yes, of course we have problems. But we look at our deficiencies so much. We look at what we don't have. We look at what is inadequate in our lives. We look at what are the things that have gone wrong. We look at how many things we did wrong. And we keep thinking, talking about them so much that they are the voices that are loudest. They stop you from hearing the voice of God. God doesn't have an edge to come inside and talk to you because your voices are drowning the voice of God. He can't even get a word edgewise, Could it be possible that some of you are looking at your faults, your problems, your difficulties, things that have gone wrong because of your mistakes, that you're blaming yourself so constantly that you're looking at yourself, your life so negatively that you stopped your ears from listening to the voice of God? That's one. There's another voice that some of us may be struggling with. It's the voice of criticism. If you're not listening to yourself, you're listening to people, everybody around you. All the things that everybody is pointing out in your life. Criticizing your work, criticizing your ability, criticizing you as a husband, criticizing you as a wife, criticizing you as a father, as a son. People keep talking about you, keep telling you what are the negative things to you, that you're listening to so much of critique that you stop paying attention to the voice of God. Could it be that some of you are allowing people's voices drown God's voice. Or maybe it's the voice of conformity. The culture around you is speaking so loudly. The culture in which you are part of, the office culture, or the culture around your, around your home, or the culture that your friends have is becoming the loudest. You are feeling the pressure of conforming to it because you're paying too much attention to what everybody is saying, everybody expects from you, and that's how you want to live your life. That's how you want to make decisions, because the voices of everybody asking you to conform with them, become like them, is become so loud that their voice, the voice of the culture around you, is drowning the voice of God. For some of you, with negative self-talk, you won't let God speak to you. God can't get a word inside you because you're talking to yourself all the time. With people's voice, when people begin to critique you, you heard that voice of critique so long and so often, you paid attention so much that you can't believe anything else about yourself but from negative. But even if God is trying to say, He's using somebody else to talk to you something positive about your life, you don't want to believe it anymore because you heard the critics so much. Number 4. So the voice of your negative self-talk, or the voice of criticism, or the voice of conformity, or the voice of condemnation by the accuser. If you're not paying attention to anything else, man, this guy never leaves you, right? He's always going to point out what you have done in the past. That he would use everything possible, every circumstance possible, every image possible to tell you that you are a guilty person, to tell you that you don't deserve what you have. You don't deserve your life, you don't deserve your job, you don't deserve promotions, you don't deserve anything that you have. He will keep talking to you, accusing you of what you have done wrong, reminding you of your past. Bible calls Satan as the accuser of the brethren, by the way. That means you and me, the brethren. He's also called, by the way, the father of lies. Meaning, even though he's accusing you, he's actually accusing you with lies. If you listen to those lies, if you're paying too much attention to what Satan is telling you, it will deafen the voice of God. If you can't hear his voice, you will not be able to sing his song. Your life goes off note. So remember this. What we perceive to be relational, emotional, spiritual, physical problems could actually be related to our hearing problems. It could be possible that you're not hearing the voice of God, so therefore you have problems in your life. I'm not saying all your problems are because of that, but I can guarantee you most of us have problems because of that. I think it's one of those verses that kind of brings sadness into us. When you look at 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1, it simply says, in those days, the voice of God was rare. In those days, nobody is hearing the voice of God. That's what it means. Nobody is hearing the voice of God. And because nobody is hearing the voice of God, everybody had problems in that nation. That nation was in a turmoil by then. Before God spoke to Samuel, the nation of Israel is reeling under persecution, reeling under oppression, no victory, difficulties everywhere. No crops, no fruits. That means they will work hard, they will work for the entire month, not receive salaries. not receive bonuses, not receive appreciation. They are struggling because they stopped hearing the voice of God. Number two, the second thing that I want to make as an observation to you is this. It is our inability to hear the voice of God that causes us to lose our voice and then our ways. It's our inability to listen to the voice of God that causes us to lose our own voice and then ultimately our ways. I don't know if have you ever thought about this? Why should God speak to Samuel? Have you ever thought about that? When there is Eli, who is a judge, and Eli, a temple priest, is there, who's somebody who knows the law of God, who knows the voice of God. Well, at least that's what we presume, that he would know the voice of God. Why would God speak to a 2-year-old boy or a 3-year-old boy and tell him what is going to happen to that nation? What would he understand? We love the story because God spoke to a 3-year-old boy. That's why we love the story. But we have never thought, why should God speak to that guy when he could have spoken to 1,000 other people? This is what I've realized. The reason God had to pick up Samuel is because everybody else stopped listening to the voice of God. And because they stopped listening to the voice of God, they lost their voice. You see, in that nation, Eli, as a judge, as a temple priest, is also the one who speaks the voice of God to the people. The one who is supposed to bring the message of God to the people. If God chose this little boy who's working as a servant to Eli, instead of speaking to Eli, he chose to speak to this little boy. It simply means Eli lost his voice. In the next point, I'll tell you why he lost the voice. But I actually think this. The more people chose not to hear the voice of God, the longer they stayed in trouble. The longer you take time to listen to the voice of God, the longer your troubles will linger in your life. The classic example is the book of Judges. The entire book of Judges in chapter 2. It's almost as if the writer comprehensively put together what is happening in that nation for a period of 300, 400 years after Joshua. In chapter 2, just the first 10 for 12 verses itself, you will begin to realize that he is putting together a cycle, a vicious cycle of people losing the blessing of God. It simply starts off like this, that God would bless the land of Israel. That means the people. That means their jobs are good, they're getting their salaries well, their businesses are doing well, their marriages are doing well, their families are doing well, children are growing up healthy, all that is happening. God is blessing them. But once God begins to bless them, they forget God. Because their eyes now turn away from the provider to the providence. And they want to keep the providence, the job, the properties, the blessing, all that, the pleasure. Because they want to keep this, then their eyes are turning to other idols that are supposedly be the ones that will provide all this. Because somebody else told them. So instead of looking at the one who actually gave them right in the beginning, they would begin to look at all this prosperity, all this money, and think that so-and-so idol will provide them, make sure that this money that they have will not go away. So therefore, they began to worship other gods, forgetting the one who actually gave them. And because they began to worship other gods, you may not do that, by the way. Even when you begin to look at your own possessions, you are doing idol worship. Let's just keep that in your mind. When you begin to give more preference to your job rather than the one who gave you the job, you're basically doing idol worship. Just keep that in your mind. And so when they begin to do this, God knows that they broke the first command. And because that's one command God doesn't want any one of us to break. And when they broke, he will allow them to be attacked by the enemy. That means God takes off his hand of protection over people. That's why we get physical difficulties in our bodies. That's why we get professional problems in our work. That's why we get relational problems. We get into relational problems. That's why we struggle with things around, because God took his hands off. God allowed the people of Israel to be oppressed by everybody. And when the oppression became so intense that they didn't have any other choice but to look to God and say, God, please forgive us for forgetting you. Can you help us? Then God would send a judge who will come and deliver them out of their troubles. Just like how we do. When we are in deep trouble, we'll then go and do 20 days, 21 days, 45 days fasting and pray and beg God to forgive us. And God, because he's a merciful God, he's a gracious God, he's slow to get angry and quick to forgive and all that stuff. We know that. So therefore we go and we beg God. God then shows mercy on us, sends a relief to us that will take away our problem. And then, because our problems are gone, we begin to be blessed right from the beginning, right there. The cycle. And then our job gets better, we get better jobs, we get promotions, our children are doing well now, their studies are going well, our family is doing well, marriages are doing well, you're basically living your dream, all that is happening there, and then you take your eyes off God. The longer you choose not to hear the voice of God, the longer your troubles are going to stay with you. Number 3, the best way to get the attention of people, the best way to get people to listen to you is for you to listen to God first. It's a brilliant principle, remember that. We live in a culture where everyone, everywhere, wants to say something. Just look at our Facebook. Everyone wants to express their opinions. I think a few days ago we were discussing about how we need to come out with a positive Christian voice on Facebook. And somebody was talking to me and said, you need to start writing articles on Facebook talking about LGBTQ and stuff like that, so that the church voice can be heard. I told him, I don't mind writing. The problem with writing them is this, that no non-Christian will read them. The one person that will read, because it's Pastor Chaitanya's post, is Christian. And when I express what Bible actually tells, it would be the Christian who will first start critiquing me, who will start throwing at me stones. The message that is supposed to go out into the world is not going at all. So therefore, I refrain from writing anything. That's what I told him. What's the point of writing when everybody wants to say something and nothing actually is being heard? Am I making sense? We live in that culture. Everybody wants to say something, but has very little to say. But if you want people to listen to you, if you want to find your voice, the best way to find your voice is to keep your mouth shut and listen to the voice of God. First, learn to listen to the voice of God. Then you will find your voice on the journey. That people will pay attention to. Making sense? See, may God give you a prophetic voice. I really want you to have a prophetic voice. But having a prophetic voice starts with a prophetic ear. You got to learn to listen to God. Finding your voice starts with hearing God's voice. That's what happened to this guy. Did you see verses 7 says, Samuel has never heard the voice of God. Samuel doesn't know who his God is. Isn't that what it says? By the time you come to verses 10, when this little boy said, God, here is your servant, speak to me. I'm willing to listen to you, he found his voice. There's a very interesting description, few verses down the line, about Samuel. This is what Bible says. That everything Samuel spoke came to be. Everything Samuel spoke came to be. You see the power in listening to the voice of God? That your voice will become powerful. People, the world will begin to pay attention to you. This culture, yes, needs right voices. But right voices will not come unless you have a right heart to listen to the voice of God. Number 4, let me close up with this. If you are not willing to listen to everything God has to say, you will eventually not hear anything at all from God. Or let me just break it down for you. If you aren't willing to listen to everything God has to say, that means there are times we will listen a little bit and leave the rest of 80%. Because that's what we like, the 20%. If you're not willing to listen to everything God has to say, you will eventually won't hear anything God has to say. Meaning this, that even if God is speaking, you can't hear. That's what happened to Eli. I told you why God had to speak to Samuel, right? You will find the reason in chapter 2. God spoke to Eli about 2 of his sons. These fellows are breaking the law of God consistently. So God is speaking to Eli and is saying, hey, you got your 2 children, they are going to bring a problem to your country. You better deal with them. God kept speaking to him. But Eli ignored the voice of God because it is his children. His own children, right? He doesn't want to punish them. He doesn't want his children to be in trouble, so he stopped warning his children. Thinking that only let God deal. By the way, parents don't ever do that. Huh? Let God deal with my children. God will kill them. That's what happened to Hophni and Phinehas. Don't do that with your children. If God tells you to warn them, please go ahead and warn them. Spank them if needed to be. You will not be able to save them otherwise. So, God spoke to Samuel and Eli and told him, please speak to them. He didn't. And because he chose not to hear everything God has to say, eventually he stopped hearing anything God has to say. It took 3 times before Eli realized God is speaking to Samuel. Do you realize that? This is somebody who's supposed to be a prophet. Huh? Somebody who would recognize anything that is godly quickly. Prophet is somebody who would know the voice of God. This guy took 3 times before he actually realized, it must be God. That's how much far away he has gone from hearing the voice of, recognizing the voice of God. God speaks to Samuel and tells the same thing to Samuel. Tell the nation of Israel, I'm going to destroy them. That's how verses 11 and 12 start off, by the way. I'm going to put them in trouble, so much trouble, because of 2 people. I already spoke about those 2 people before. But because nobody is paying attention to me, I'm going to destroy them. Hey, listen. I know it's a scary thing to talk about that, but let me give you the flip side. If you want to hear the comforting voice of God, you got to listen to his convicting voice. If you, the thing is, sometimes I think we are so afraid of what God is going to say, that's why we choose not to listen to God. It's often what we want to hear the least is what we need to hear the most. Think about it. It's often what we want to hear the least is often what we need to hear the most. God's voice is good. It doesn't condemn, but it convicts. If his voice today is convicting you, it's good. It's good. His voice doesn't cause fear, it causes comfort. Meaning this, that you know that you did wrong, and you also know this, that if you go back, he will forgive. It doesn't confuse us, but it challenges us, definitely. It's the only voice that can quieten us with peace. His voice is joy. His voice is wisdom. His voice is healing. His voice is peace. His voice is power. His voice is grace. His voice is truth. So I'm challenging you today. Pray the bravest prayer you will ever pray. Because the point is this. The reason I'm calling it the bravest prayer is this. Once you pray that prayer, whatever you hear after that, you must do it. That's why it's the bravest prayer. But by choosing to do that, your life may never be the same. Who knows that in 1 week, all those problems that look like giants, Goliaths in your life, could just simply tumble down simply because today you prayed 7 most important words that you will ever pray. Speak, Lord, I'm listening. You may look at me and say, like Samuel, I don't know how the voice of God sounds like. I understand that. We'll talk about how to discern the voice of God. You may not know how to discern the voice of God, never heard the voice of God, but you can start with asking God to speak to you. You may not be able to recognize it right now. You may think you may not be able to recognize it, but chances are you will recognize it the moment you pray that prayer. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Would you close your eyes right now? And if what God spoke to you today made sense to you, would you just offer that prayer? Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. That one prayer, honest, truthful prayer, could actually change your life. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. If you recognize that the voice of God has been deafened by so many other voices in your life, and today you recognize that God spoke to you and challenged you, convicted you, and you want to hear his voice, would you, wherever you are, would you stand to your feet? I'd like to pray with you. My prayer you're not going to hear, but your heart would make his voice be heard. So if that is your prayer, and you recognize, hey, I've lost my ability to hear the voice of God, and I want to hear the voice of God, would you just stand to your feet, wherever you are? I just want to pray with you. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, God. Jesus. Father, I want to thank you, God, for everyone who's standing. I pray that, God, that as they stand and as they confess that they allowed other voices to deafen their hearing and lost the ability to recognize your voice, and God lost their way, lost their voice itself. I pray that, God, that you would begin to speak to them as they ask you to speak to them. They stand in honesty, God. They stand in this congregation, among these people. They know that people are watching them. They know that that this could be a direct confession that they have no relationship with you. But I'm glad they did that, God. I'm sure you are glad that they did that. That they want to say, God, I'm sorry for not choosing to hear your voice, not listening to you anymore, but we want to hear your voice. What a transformation, God. I pray for everyone who's standing up right now and offering that prayer to you, saying, speak, Lord. The servant is listening. And based on their confession, based on their heart, speak to them, God, so that they may find their voice. They may find their way. And God, what miraculous things could happen because they find their voices, God. Thank you for being a God who's choosing to speak to us, always speaking to us. As we worship you, be glorified in our midst, God. May your name be lifted up high and higher. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. Every one of us, would you stand to your feet along with everyone else and sing this song, sing worship along with us.